Right. How's everybody doing? Well, we're on week 6, and we're talking about strain theory, right? And just like weeks in the past, right, there's kind of a old theory and a new theory, right? Traditional and souped up version, the contemporary version, right? And in the first one, the more traditional one, was originally presented in an article in 1938, right? So pre-World War II, right? So, it's pretty far back there, not as far back as some of the other theories that we've talked about. But, and that's Robert Merton's strain anomie theory. That sometimes is referred to strain theory. It's just kind of shortened. And then it borrows some ideas from Emil Durkheim's theories of anomie, and we'll talk about that. And then the more contemporary, more up-to-date theory is Robert Agnew's general strain theory, right? And you'll see this word strain appearing, right? And then you'll also see the word anomie appearing across Durkheim's work and then Merton's, and you see strain appearing in Merton's and then in Agnew's, right? And we'll try to disentangle all that, right? Because they are using they're using the exact same words, but they are changing the meaning slightly, but not completely changing the meaning, all right? Robert Merton, he is a structural functionalist, right? So you remember this structural functionalist approach that you should have learned in introductory sociology, right? So they're always kind of looking at large-scale macro structures, and when they find some pattern, they believe that serves some important function, right? He is in that tradition. Of course, Emil Durkheim is as well, right? Emil Durkheim's kind of most important thinker or founding father of structural functionalism, right? And I guess that's a good place to start, right? Emil Durkheim, I guess we hadn't talked about him yet, right? If you took introductory sociology, you should learn a little bit about him, right? French sociologist, writing a lot of his stuff kind of shortly after the French Revolution. I guess I could look at the exact dates, but the exact dates don't matter a whole lot, but sometimes I just like to satisfy my curiosity, right? So he's a French, and he was born in 1858. Wow, that's a long time ago, right? Right before the Civil War, right? And he died in 1917, right? So right before the Great Depression, right? And that was a time in Europe, and particularly in France, where there was unbelievable social change, right? We were moving from a feudal society to an industrialized society. We were moving from a rural society to an urban society, growth of cities. We already kind of talked about that with social disorganization. There was also some things happening, like kind of the decline of religion, particularly the decline of the power of the Catholic Church that was happening in Europe. It's like rapid social change, although it's not happening overnight. It's happening over decades and centuries when we talk about industrialization and urbanization and secularization, right? And one of Durkheim's most important concepts is that of anomie, right? And anomie, he believes, happens when we experience rapid social change, because an anomie is often referred to as normlessness, right? It is not anarchy, but it is normlessness in the sense most of our norms in society are related to roles or statuses that we occupy, right? So, there are things that are expected of professors, fathers, students, on and on, right? And if a lot of those things change, you're no longer a lord or a serf, right? But you're a factory worker or owner, and you no longer live in a village in the countryside. You live in a city. Then you're occupying new roles in society, and because those are brand new, right? People don't know how to act, right? That is the sense of normlessness that Durkheim was talking about, right? That the old traditional norms that govern our social life are no longer applicable in this new modern world, right? And Durkheim believes that caused a lot of problems. It caused a loss in solidarity, unity, and cohesion in society. And one result of that would be selfish behavior like crime, but also self-destructive behavior like suicide and substance use as well, right? And and that's his. All right, you see how he described and he defined anomie, and then Robert Merton comes along and he's being influenced by Durkheim, but he also kind of has his own ideas, right? Robert Merton is an American; he's not a Frenchman, right? Emile Durkheim is a man, and you read his name, you might think it's Emily, but it's Emile, right? Robert Merton spent most of his life at Harvard. He graduated from Harvard, and there's this kind of important shift that happens in sociology and in criminology, where it moves away from Europe. And first, it's at University of Chicago, very elite school, but it's not Harvard, right? Around the time of World War II, and maybe a little bit before, all the action moves away from the University of Chicago, where that's kind of the center of all intellectual development, early 1900s. Then it shifts to all the Ivy League schools, and Robert Merton is part of that, right? And and I kind of want to point that out. And boy, the 40s, 50s, early 60s, Ivy League schools, all in the Northeast, in New England states and stuff like that. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Dartmouth, Cornell, right? All those, that becomes kind of the center of attention, where people are, most important sociologists and criminologists are either educated in those places or they work in those places, right? That's a big shift, right? In where people are thinking about crime and how they're influencing people, right? And that's not really the case anymore. Things start changing in the late 60s and 70s. All right, so he's American. He's a structural functionalist. Structural functionalists tend to be fairly conservative as far as political ideology. Conflict theorists tend to be considerably more radical, right? As a general rule, right? And here's what Merton says about society and about how crime is a result from the way that we organize our society. Right? He argues that crime is not abnormal or pathological. This is something that Durkheim said, that crime and deviance are normal parts of society, right? And but given the way that American society is organized, particularly in terms of its institutionalized means and its cultural goals, which I'll define in a second, that because of the way that those things are in the United States, we're going to have more crime than other countries like us, right? Countries like us, high income, democracies. We're right. Here's how it goes, right? First thing I need to define is cultural goals, and then I'll go to institutionalized means. It kind of makes more sense to talk about these things in this order, right? Culturally defined goals are the things that really everyone wants, or pretty much everyone wants. There's vast consensus. These things are largely universal, right? And they haven't changed a whole lot since 1938 when he wrote this, right? We define success in the United States largely through material possessions, right? I'm not immune to this. Some people are maybe more materialistic than others, right? But I work, and one of the reasons why I do that is a paycheck, and I take that paycheck and I can buy stuff, right? It's probably the same reason that most people work, really, right? If we're brutally honest about that, right? And throughout my life, right, I have been working, right, toward this goal, maybe even when I wasn't working, when I was a student, right? And this is where institutionalized means come in, right? Material wealth, material affluence, those are the cultural goals in American society. In other societies, they were different, right? But in a lot of countries, it is like, capitalism, consumerism, and stuff like that. Everybody likes nice stuff, designer clothes and nice cars and trucks and nice houses, all this kind of stuff, right? And, we evaluate each other based upon that stuff, right? And that determines if you're successful or not successful, right? That's cultural goals. The institutionalized means are the ways of obtaining those things, right? And there's some, that are institutionalized, and there's some that aren't really institutionalized. They're deviant ways, right? Let's talk about how conformists, people that stay out of trouble for the most part, right, achieve the cultural goal of material affluence or wealth, right, and material possessions and all that. Right? I was taught, and I'm sure you were taught from a very early age, that if you want nice things, if you want to be successful, that you go to school, you make good grades, you stay out of trouble, right? You get in college, then you get a college degree, and hopefully you get a good GPA, right? And then maybe you go to graduate school, but maybe you'll just get a job, right? And by virtue of doing those things, going to school, making good grades, you get into college, then go to college, make good grades again. You have a high GPA, then some will go to graduate school, some will say a bachelor's degree is enough, right? And you kind of play your cards, and if you play them right, it's going to be much more likely that you own a house, own a car, right? That you can afford clothes and all the kind of material affluence and wealth and stuff like that, right? Now, here's the thing about institutionalized means. And this was this is still true, but it was much easier to see in 1938. Those institutionalized means are not available to everyone equally, right? We don't, even today, right? We don't all have the same opportunities to achieve material wealth, right? But in 1938, it was easy to see that some people, poor people, people of color, Native Americans, Hispanics quite often, were excluded from a lot of educational opportunities. They had their own schools, and typically those were they were not separate and equal. They were not equal at all. They're typically far inferior, right? In all the important ways that you can measure that, right? And that's true of our colleges as well, right? And but if you were whiter and your parents were more affluent, then you had more opportunities, right? You had more access to those institutionalized means, right? And I hope everyone sees that, like, this was written in 1938, and certain people were not going to Alabama or Montevallo or Auburn or any of these places. They're certainly not going to places like Harvard, where Merton was, right? There was educational discrimination, right? And so that discrimination, that's different educational opportunities, institutionalized means. And then there's also widespread job discrimination, right? Certain jobs, high-paying jobs, were given almost exclusively to richer and whiter people, right? So the institutionalized means are not universal, right? They vary quite a bit, and that's still true to some extent, right? Probably, certainly not as bad as it was in 1938, right? And civil rights is, the story of how that changes, right? But there's still differences, right? If you grow up poor and, you're probably not going to go to schools that are highest ranked in your neighborhood, right? I mean, rich neighborhoods tend to have school systems that rank highly, and poorer neighborhoods tend to have ones that rank lower, right? So some of this is still true, right? Particularly when it pertains to class. Some of it has changed when it deals with race, but we're far from equal in terms of race, certainly not in terms of class, right? And and so that's the culturally defined goals. Everybody wants to be rich, essentially, and then the institutionalized means: go to school, stay out of trouble, learn, make high grades, get a good GPA, get into a better college, make high GPA, right, and on, right? That's going to help you achieve. And that's what most people do, even in 1938, and that's what he calls the mode of adaptation of conformity, right? If you're following along, and you probably should be following along in these slides, it might be helpful if you look at number 6. Slide number 6, where it says adaptations. These are, sometimes he refers to them as modes of adaptations. And so the conformity, and you see I have goals and means. That's what I was referring to as institutionalized goals, and the means of achieving those. Cultural goals, institutionalized means. I think I said that backwards for a second. Excuse me. Most people do those things, and most people in this class do those things, and that's why you're in college, and you're hoping that it's going to pay off later in your life, right? Maybe not the first job that you get is going to provide you with all the material wealth and stuff. Certainly was not the case for me, my first job out of college. But eventually, if you work hard and show up on time, you do what you're supposed to do, you don't get in trouble, you'll rise up the corporate ladder, right? And and that's how essentially we achieve the American dream, right? Now, I know that the American dream is somewhat in jeopardy for a lot of people, and it's more difficult, but most of us still hope it's going to come true for us. And we're still kind of playing the rules of the game are kind of the same as far as the means of achieving those things, right? And college does help you quite a bit, right, in that, right? No doubt about it, and all the research says that, even though there's some people that argue just be a welder or something like that, and you can make more money. College drastically improves income, right, as well as status in society. There's all the research, there's vast consensus about this, right? People with bachelor's degree make a lot more money. All right. But let's talk about those people who don't have access to those institutionalized means. They don't have the same opportunities. And we already talked about poorer people, right? Lower socioeconomic status. Let's also talk about minorities, particularly those that were discriminated, even to a much greater extent in the past than they are now. Now, I'd say they still are, certainly, right? But there has been progress, right? These people are still going to want material wealth and influence. They're still going to want nice things, right? But they will adapt to this situation where everyone wants material wealth, but not everyone can get it, right? A society that's like that, where everyone wants something, but not everyone has equal opportunity to achieve it, that's what Merton calls strain, right? That the individual experiences, the society experiences anomie, right? A society that has this goal that's universal, material wealth, but the institutionalized means do not provide the opportunities to everyone. That's anomie, right? Societies experience anomie. That's this kind of micro level. Individuals experience strain. And when they experience strain, they will adapt, right? And so one way that people will adapt, they'll still want those material possessions, but they'll go through alternative or innovative ways to obtain them. And a lot of those innovative ways of getting money, but not going to school and not working hard and stuff like that, include crime, right? So you're looking at this, we're moved down to here, innovation, right? This explains most crime according to Merton, right? You want these things, but you don't have the opportunity, or, perhaps you choose not to, go to school and work hard, or maybe you're not too bright or anything like that. Or you're discriminated against. So you do things like you steal, right? You burglarize places, you sell drugs, right? You see how that's an innovative way of obtaining the goal, but it's you're kind of working a way to get to your goal. That's not the typical conformist institutionalized way, right? That really explains most crime, right? Now, there are some other adaptations, right? So if you're looking at this slide 6, you see conformity, then you see innovation, then you will see ritualism, right? And let's talk about it a little bit, but not as much, because it doesn't explain, like conformity explains most behavior, period, right? Innovation explains most criminal behavior. Ritualism and retreatism and rebellion, they don't explain much, but it's kind of interesting, and it does explain some, right? Robert Merton talks about a janitor as an example of ritualism. A janitor is someone that goes to work every day, works hard. Are they ever going to get rich? No. Being a janitor is typically a dead-end job, right? They won't be as poor as some people, but they're still going to be poor, right? And, is that really, it's not criminal to be a janitor. Is it deviant? Merton argues that it is. Now, typically I have some students like, oh, no, that's, noble or praiseworthy or something like that. And, in some ways it is, you're not going to get rich, but you do the right thing and stuff. Typically when students kind of, make these arguments and stuff, I ask them this: when you grow up, and you have kids. Do you want them to grow up to be a janitor, right? And you're no. Well, now you understand what I'm talking about, right? That's not our hopes, right? And Merton kind of talks about this. It's not as deviant as stealing and stuff like that, right? Or selling drugs. In fact, it's not criminal at all, but, it is kind of stigmatized. Not a lot, but a little bit, right? And Robert Merton talks about maybe kind of talk about those people as maybe being a sucker, right? They work hard, like they put a lot into it, there's effort, and do their job, but they don't really get rewarded for it. It's not like you clean an office building really well and you'll get a promotion, right? And you can work your way up to vice president and CEO. It doesn't work like that, right? All right, that's ritualism. The next thing is what he calls retreatism, right? And retreatism is when you reject the means. You no longer want to get wealthy and have all the material possessions, and you also reject the institutionalized means of achieving. So you don't go to school, work hard, and rise up through the corporate ladder, right? That's and examples of this are drug addicts, alcoholics, some people that are mentally ill. Homeless people quite often are like, sometimes mentally ill, sometimes they have problems with addiction, sometimes both, right? Quite often both, right? But I have known homeless people, and I have, studied homeless people in the past, and there are some people that are mentally healthy. They're not addicted to drugs or alcohol, but they just don't want to participate in the rat race, right? They don't want a house. They don't want a car even, They want to live a kind of simple life, right? That's retreatism. Whether it's the drug addict, what does the drug addict want? They want another fix. What does the alcoholic want? They want another drink. That's their goal, right? And in order to achieve that goal, some of them will engage in criminal behavior, but some drug addicts will, I don't know, like find junk and recycle, aluminum cans and copper, and sometimes, right? So, sometimes the goal is different, right? And the means of achieving it is different too, right? They reject both of those, right? And that's retreatism. And then the next one is rebellion. This is the final one, right? So there's 5 of these. 1, conformity. 2, 3, 4, 5. 1's non-deviant. Conformity is not deviant, right? The other 4 are deviant. And they're not all equally deviant, right? So here's the last one, right? There are those people in society that reject both the means and the goals, but they seek to replace it with new means and goals, right? This includes political revolutionaries. This includes Karl Marx, right? This also includes cult leaders, right? David Koresh and, all these Jim Jones, right? They're rejecting mainstream, and they're often instructing people to quit their jobs and stuff like that. They have a different goal, right? It's typically like, depending, it might be some utopian society for Karl Marx. For a lot of religious cults, it might be salvation, right? It might be heaven on earth, right? It might be enlightenment if they've been influenced by kind of Eastern philosophies and stuff like that. But it's different than the cultural goals that most people have, right? And you know what? I suppose that this would include Christianity early on, right? And and that's kind of interesting, right? It wouldn't include, a lot of Christianity today, particularly like prosperity gospel, right? Totally, has the goal of material affluence. And if you don't know what prosperity gospel is, Google it real quick. Yeah, and you know what? That's pretty much it for Robert Merton. I'm going to try to get through the next, more contemporary thing with Robert Agnew. And I have thrown in some graphics in this PowerPoint, and I hope you like those. I have a picture of Robert Merton. It's an old black and white picture like you would see in the 1930s, 1940s. And then I also have a picture of Robert Agnew. And Robert Agnew is a colored picture. And as far as I know, he's still alive, unless he's died just recently, and I'm not aware of it. He is retired, I'm fairly sure, but he still publishes stuff. And he spent most of his career at Emory, right? Not an Ivy League school, but an elite private school, of course, in Atlanta. And I've met Robert Agnew at conferences, and I've met a number of his students. And all his students are, guess what they're testing, what they're writing dissertations and theses and publishing. They're all testing general strain theory. This is his major accomplishment, right? This is his life work, right? And I pointed out earlier that, just like Merton's strain anomie theory, this has the word general strain, right? So here, and it's similar to that individual level strain that Merton has, but it's more general, right? So the name is telling you, although a lot of times people don't realize what's general about general strain theory, right? So let me try to explain this in as short amount of time as I can, right? Because I could take 2 hours to explain Agnew's theory, but we're not going to do that, right? Robert Agnew agrees with everything that Merton says, right? But he says that's not the only form of strain. There are other forms of strain, right? Now, what Merton said is that if you want the goal of material affluence and you're blocked from achieving it, you don't have that will create conditions ripe for crime, right? Agnew agrees with that. But he says there's other goals besides material affluence. It's not just material wealth and affluence that we want. We also want respect or social status. We'd rather be at the top of hierarchies rather than the bottom of them, right? So that's a different goal, right? We can also not just be blocked from any goal, right? We can also already have something and someone threatens to take that from us, or they do take that from us, right? And when that happens, people will often respond in criminal behavior, right? If someone tries to take my truck, someone tries to take my house, move into my house and start squatting in my house, I'm going to have something to say about that, right? And I'm going to resist, right? I might assault them, right? I mean, it could potentially be a homicide, right? Now, I would be justified in my house and stuff like that, but if someone tried to take my phone, right? What would you do if some stranger walked up to you? That's something that you possess, and someone's threatening to take it away from you. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people will respond. Assault, things of that sort, right? So the idea is like, and there's one other form of strain, right? You block from any goal, right? you have something that you value, positively valued stimuli, and someone threatens to take that away. And the third thing is people do noxious stimuli is what he calls it, right? It has all this like scientific sounding jargon in it, right? And it borrows heavily from psychology because Robert Agnew has a master's degree in psychology, right? He has some background in psychology. I'm pretty sure it's a master's degree. So it has this kind of scientific sounding jargon, positively valued stimuli, noxious stimuli. Noxious stimuli is like if someone does something unpleasant to you, hits you, you might hit them back. If they, if someone when you're young molests you, you might, probably not when you're young, but maybe when you get older, right? You might seek revenge upon that person, right? But you might not. You might, learn to deal with those difficult emotions in other ways, cope with those difficult traumatic emotions in other ways, right? And if that has happened to you, I'd encourage you to seek treatment for that and get, a lot of us have had traumatic things happen to us, and it's always good to seek professional help and learn to deal with the noxious stimuli, right? Now, do people who are abused sexually, physically, emotionally, do they grow up and are they more likely to commit crime than kids that are not physically abused, sexually abused, neglected? Oh yeah, they're much more like, this is like one of the major predictors of juvenile delinquency, right? In general, strain provides a theoretical explanation for that. Here's what happens when people do you experience noxious stimuli, people do unpleasant things toward you. It will make you mad. It will create this emotion of anger, and you will not like that emotion. You will not like to stew in anger for long before you do something. Anger motivates us to stop thinking and do something, right? And oftentimes that something is committing acts of crime, right? So that's how strain, those three different types, right? Block from achieving a goal, threaten to remove positively valued stimuli, and then presentation of noxious stimuli, unpleasant things. Those three things happen to people. They will get angry. They will experience this emotion. And as a result of it, they will become ready to act. And when they act, they will often act in criminal ways, right? Sometimes they'll be justified if it's, self-defense or something like that. But other times, maybe perhaps not, right? And they'll be labeled as and convicted and labeled a criminal, right? Do you see how that Robert Merton is about one specific form of strain? You want one particular goal material well, but people are blocked from it. So they innovate, they retreat, they rebel. They do all those things, right? And you're like, Robert Agnew is like, yeah, you're onto something. I like that part of your theory. But there are other forms of strain besides what Robert Merton says. Like, he's like, you're onto something, but there's more to it than this. There's also, you already have something and someone threatens or does take that positively valued stimuli away from you. And then there's the other thing people do, the presentation of noxious stimuli. People do unpleasant things to you. Now, I talked about abuse and trauma and stuff like that, right? But, lots of crime if you commit a crime against me, I might get angry and I might commit a crime back, right? Steal something from me. I might steal something back from you to get even. Hit me, I might hit you back, right? Yeah. Yeah, so it's like, that's in a nutshell, Merton strain theory, and then the general strain theory. And I hope everyone, and maybe I'll beat it to death, but you see how that's much more Agnew is more general, right? There are other types of strain. Merton's real specific as opposed to general, right? And then here's the other thing that I want to point out about differences between these two. For Merton, he's most of the time talking about society and at a macro level. Robert Agnew, most of the time, is talking about individuals, right? One's a macro theory, one's a micro theory, right? Now, there are times where Agnew talks about macro stuff, and there are times where Merton talks about micro stuff, particularly in the examples and stuff. But one does tend to be macro, and one tends to be micro. One tends to be focused upon the way society is organized, characteristics of society. And the other one is more about individuals, emotional states of individuals and stuff like that. Right? I really like both of them, and I think they help us think about crime, right? They help us. They help us think about crime. They help us predict crime. They can help us respond to crime, right? They have policy implications. If you believe these things, like if you believe Merton's right, then create more opportunities for those people that are excluded from educational opportunities and job opportunities. And if you do that, we should get less crime, right? If you believe in Agnew's theory, well, get people to treat each other better, right? And even if they still treat each other bad and like block people from achieving their goals, or take things or threaten to take things or do unpleasant stuff to each other, you can teach them coping mechanisms. You can teach them ways to not get angry and to stay in that emotional state of anger. And you can teach people to control their impulses when they're angry, right? If unpleasant things were done to you, right? You can get therapy, and that stuff won't be as bad as it has always seemed in the past, right? It won't dominate your thinking. You won't ruminate upon those harmful things that people did to you. And if you can develop some coping mechanisms, and there are people, professionals that can teach you these things, right? Through therapy and counseling, then you won't muck your life up by committing crimes, and which ultimately can harm you. They can harm the other person, right? And sometimes there is a time for revenge, but sometimes there's like, let's try to get you past it. It's for your own good to get past these difficult things that were done to you, particularly if they were done a long time ago when you were a child. And and you see like those are the policy implications of these things, right? Of both Merton's and Agnew's. And I like both of these theories, right? I suppose that's everything I need to say. And that was less than 45 minutes, so I did pretty good, right? Y'all have a nice day. And if you have any questions, as normal, just send me an email, give me a call. Y'all have a nice day.